Here we come to Katja Vawova's paper, Debunking Evolutionary Debunking, and she gives us a very astute and very helpful argument about dialectical or argumentative burden when it comes to these genealogical and evolutionary debunking arguments. So let's return to Schoenfield's argument and think about it as an evolutionary debunking argument. So we saw this already. I'll just quickly go over it. If we cannot set a belief aside when evaluating the truth of that belief, then we cannot recover that belief from the perspective of doubt. We cannot set aside our evaluative beliefs that have been shaped by evolutionary processes when evaluating the arguments that support those beliefs, because that would be like setting aside our own mind. Therefore, we cannot recover our evaluative beliefs that have been shaped by evolutionary processes. So they've been called into doubt by an evolutionary debunking argument, and there's no way to recover them, because to recover them, we'd have to set them aside, and to set them aside, we would have to set aside our entire mind. Okay, so here's her argument again. It's in the box, and Vavova comes in here and she says, baked into this argument is a questionable assumption about dialectical burden. So dialectical burden is basically burden of proof. The question is, when you're in an argument, who has the burden of proof? So when it comes to genealogical debunking arguments, where does the burden of proof lie? Does it lie with the person who is being debunked? Or does it lie with the debunker herself? So the argument we just considered, or the kind of Schoenfield version of the evolutionary debunking argument, that's an argument that's structured that puts the burden on the person whose beliefs are being debunked. And Vavova is going to switch that, and she's going to say that actually doesn't work. The burden of proof has to be on the debunker herself. So first of all, what's the assumption that's being made about dialectical burden? Well, the debunker thinks that we owe her something. Specifically, she says that we owe her a reason to think that we are not mistaken in our evaluative beliefs. And that reason has to be one that doesn't presuppose the truth of those beliefs. Okay, so that's premise one. You've got to be able to set the beliefs aside and give us a reason that doesn't depend on those beliefs. In other words, we owe her a reason that is independent of what is called into question by the debunking argument. So what is an independent reason? Well, a reason that is independent of P, where P is a proposition, is a reason to believe P that doesn't rely on P or on the evidence and arguments on which P is based. So an independent reason is what the debunker says that we owe her. It's got to be one that doesn't depend on the things that are being debunked. And Vavova questions this. She says, do we really owe this to the debunker? And her answer is no. She doesn't think we do, because if the debunker actually works with this assumption, her argument does more than she actually wants it to. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's Vavova's very astute reconstruction of the debunker's argument. So she says, first premise, call it influence. Evolutionary forces have influenced our evaluative beliefs. Second premise, we have no good reason to think that our evaluative beliefs are true. Why not? Because they've been influenced by things that don't bear on the truth of those beliefs. That's something that we've been talking about a lot. So she's just formulating the thing that we've already been talking about. No good, premise 3. If you have no good reason to think that your belief is true, then you cannot rationally maintain it. And then the conclusion is revision. We cannot rationally maintain our evaluative beliefs. So she says we can't rationally maintain our evaluative beliefs because you need a good reason for any belief that you have, and we have no good reason for maintaining them. So the assumption that she's worried about comes in here, and this is the assumption about dialectical burden. The debunker here demands a good reason, that is, a reason that is independent of the belief that's been called into question, and the arguments and evidence for that belief. And what Vavova argues, and it's a very important argument for the purposes of this class, is that the principle no good is unreasonable because no good gets the debunker more doubt than she's after. Why? She says, think about it this way. Let's start by assuming no good. If you have no good reason to think that the proposition P is true, that is, if you have no independent reason to believe P that does not rely on P or on the evidence and arguments for P, then you cannot rationally maintain that belief. That implies that I can't believe that perception, memory, or rational intuition is a valid source of knowledge. None of those is a valid source of knowledge if I can't believe that unless I have a good reason to believe it, defined as an independent reason. Why? Because you can't justify any of those things without appealing to their deliverances. And this is something that we talked about when we looked at Alston's argument and reconstructed it. You can't justify perception without showing some evidence from perception to point out that it works. You can't justify rational intuition without relying on reason when you're making an argument. And you can't justify that memory is a genuine source of knowledge without referring to some memories that were accurate. So if you can't believe in something unless you can provide an independent reason to believe in it that doesn't rely on that belief or on the evidence and arguments for that belief, then you can't trust any of the most common sources of knowledge. So we don't want to doubt these common sources of knowledge because they're perfectly good belief-forming processes. So that's what Vavova means when she says that the no good principle gets the debunker more than what she actually wants. So Vavova concludes on the basis of this that no good is no good. No good is not a good principle. The debunker doesn't want skepticism. She wants to undermine a particular set of beliefs by using scientific evidence. So look at the very first premise. Evolutionary forces have influenced our evaluative beliefs. How does the debunker know that? Well, she knows that because scientific research has been done into the nature of biological organisms for hundreds of years, and on the basis of that inquiry, we've drawn some conclusions about how things evolve. In other words, she knows that because she takes science seriously. But, as we just saw on the last slide, if we rely on the no good principle, if we demand that everything that we believe is justified by a good independent reason, then we can't know that any of our scientific claims are true. So when debunking leads to skepticism, you can't even get the argument for debunking off the ground because the very first premise requires that we have scientific knowledge. Moreover, the whole thing is an argument. So we just saw if the no good principle is true, then you can't rely on rational intuition. Why? Because you cannot justify rational intuition without relying on reason. At the very least, you have to make arguments. And if you're making arguments, you are assuming that making arguments is a reliable belief-forming process. So Vavova is saying, if your debunking argument relies on the no good principle and demands an independent reason for every single belief that you hold, then the argument itself will fail because the argument itself depends on scientific knowledge and reasoning, which both depend on things like perception, memory, and rational intuition. And perception, memory, and rational intuition cannot pass the test of the no good principle. So the debunker's point is not that we can't independently establish that our evaluative beliefs are right. No one could do that, so that can't be what the debunker is really after. The debunker's actual point is that in learning the backstory about the origin of our evaluative beliefs, we get good reason to think that our beliefs are wrong, that some error might have creeped in. Influences that don't bear on the truth of our beliefs are causally impacting those beliefs. So that's evidence of error. Evidence of evolutionary influence is evidence of potential error. And when we get such evidence, we must accommodate it with appropriate revision. So Vavova is saying This is the actual goal of debunking arguments, and it's a much more modest goal. It's not an argument that demands that absolutely everything that we believe be justified by some good independent reason, because that would make knowledge impossible.